All right. So as we're starting with all of these conversations, just recognizing what this conversation is about and what it takes to be in this conversation, I want to start with our sort of ritual that we're developing around acknowledging gender-based violence. So take your hands off the keyboard. No more clicking just for a minute. No more typing. Just take your hands off and take hold of your own hand. Jennifer, you're okay. So take hold of your own hand, however you want to, whatever is comfortable for you. Oh, I haven't done this one yet. We are not alone. We have power in our own hands. This is not a light topic. And in this conversation, we will intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. These discussions might trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, are many survivors of gender-based violence, and we all participate in the political, social, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and facilitate violence. In fact, violence kills more women between ages of 15 and 40 than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war combined. And yet, for example, in India, less than 1% of survivors reported gender-based violence to formal sources. A moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment, somewhere, to someone. So now reverse your hands. Notice the difference. We've come together to create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in our world, and connected in new ways, we can do even more. Now that we're fully grounded in this conversation, and I do recognize as you're going through your day, sort of it takes a little bit to move out of, when you get to go to a conference, you go into this like hotel thing, and then they lock you in there for days, and you just have a sustained conversation. So I can only imagine what it takes for you all to step out of your day-to-day and back into the conference, being sort of moving in and out. But so this is a framing conversation. This is in one of the first sets. And so I promise no tangible outcomes of moving to action from this conversation, right? As we go through the arc of the conversation, this is a framing conversation, then we move to strategy, and then those are 10 conversations between the two. And then we have 20 conversations in design and implementation. So the vast majority of our conversations will be in action. But my mind personally was blown by the conversation we had this morning of just how we come in with frames of how we think about things. And so that's the purpose of these conversations, to sort of wrestle with topics. And so this one is, I think I've been looking forward to this conversation for a couple years. Just the ability to wrestle with women's economic empowerment and its relationship to gender-based violence. And we're going to think about that in a couple different angles, but that's basically this conversation. So maybe starting off, in the world that you sit in, and again, I think we're continuing to jump into these conversations with not lots of introductions. Everybody's got their name up. You can go and find out more about who they are and where they sit, and the fact that there's somebody from Convergence at Convergence, and if that is a time-space continuum problem, but that's where Adi works. And so in this, thinking a little bit about what is women's economic empowerment? How is it framed in your world? Who wants to start?
Hi, this is Liz. In my world, I would say it is completely ignored as a reality of the environment for folks that I'm trying to help move out of domestic violence situations. And I would say, from my purview, the domestic violence movement as a whole, as I've seen it over the last 3.5 years, is ignoring the economic and poverty-based realities of the majority of victims of domestic violence.
Wow. Okay. Wow. It's an opening values. Very helpful. Who's next?
Marley, I'll go next. Haven't had my lunch yet. But, so I work with entrepreneurs in conflict-affected countries. And so women's empowerment is looked at in terms of access to finance, in terms of their, role in the business as a manager, as an owner, sometimes looking at the issues of decision-making and leadership. But I would also say that violence is ignored.
Yeah.
This is Christy Shannon. I'll piggyback off what Liz said, because we're in the same world in domestic violence services. And yeah, I would say it's ignored in that economic empowerment's ignored. We all know, advocates know the importance of it, and some funding streams will help, like microloans here or that type of thing. But as far as the criminal justice system goes, it's not taken into account. As far as substantive funding to help people get out of their situations, it's not supported. And that's, I would say, why I'm at this conference, because there's finance in it and we need some real solutions, for sure.
So Christy, maybe coming back to you and Liz for 1 second, because understanding that it's ignored, if you had it, what would you think it is? Right? Like, when it is framed, when funders come in and say, we'll help you develop women's economic empowerment, what do people mean by that?
Currently, what they mean, I feel like, I'll see what Liz agrees, but like you'll have local banks, right? And they say, we want to help with economic empowerment. We want to help your clients, but a frickin' $10,000 grant doesn't go far. It doesn't really teach skills. It's like a combination of skills over time, money they can use as they need to use it, and really knowledge how to budget for themselves, because a lot of folks obviously don't have somebody helping them with that. And I don't know if that's a local pot of funding. I mean, obviously some of us are in the grassroots movement and you kind of do it locally, but it's not really addressing the problem in a deep level. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, helpful, but a lot of around financial, maybe access to capital, but maybe a little bit more on financial literacy, right? How do you engage?
Yeah, so when I think maybe private entities or public entities want to get involved, they are using the term empowerment maybe inaccurately, because in our world, we know it means they need money now, they need to know how to best use it for their situation, not you give us a grant, we give them some money, or you give them a microloan, and they don't maybe have the context or the skills they've lost over time because of control by their partner to actually properly be able to do that for themselves and truly empower themselves. Empowerment isn't a grant, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's more than that.
Helpful, very helpful. Liz, when you're finished with lunch, we could come back and see if you want to add anything more in terms of how it's framed. But Jennifer?
Sure. I think probably the way it's framed in the world that I work in, which is economic development, I think it's very similar to what Marla said, that we focus a lot more on encouraging entrepreneurship and incorporating people, but women, a lot of women into supply chains and into markets. And we're much more focused on the economic engagement side, and we talk a lot about women's economic empowerment as crucial to greater gender equality. We see it as one of many vehicles to get to this goal, but we really don't talk a lot about gender-based violence. What we talk about is something that we kind of refer to in a very blanket way as unintended consequences. And it certainly would be part of that group of things that we talk about, but I really don't think that we have a lot of tools to, we try and avoid having it happen by community engagement and things that we've seen work reasonably well, but we don't really engage directly on the issue of gender-based violence. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Man. So we just have to tackle women's economic empowerment first in this conversation, and then we'll get to gender-based violence. So it's step one. Very cool. How's it framed for other people? Brittany, you want to go?
Yeah, I think if I can go next, yeah.
Yeah.
Just from my perspective in our professional world, for context, I work at an organization called Convergence Finance, as Joy mentioned earlier, and we make grants for blended finance, financial structures, and we see a lot of interest from our investors and from our funders to work and sort of look for pipeline and deals in the economic empowerment, women's economic empowerment space. But oftentimes we see that a gender lens has been applied to the overall sort of structure, but it's not really embedded in the vehicle. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the times the beneficiaries are identified as women and underrepresented groups, often in these emerging markets, but there's not a lot of direct impact that takes place. It's often thought of as, well, if we fulfill the economic empowerment sort of needs for this particular area, the women by default will be benefited from that, and there's almost a lack of sort of a collection of data to sort of validate that. So puts us in a weird spot sometimes to how do we justify it to the funders if we do take on the task of looking for pipeline of deals in this realm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just, it might be because I live in a similar world to you, Adi, but sometimes within that, getting access to a pipeline of deals could just be that it's a woman-led business, right? That's what the pipeline is about. Correct?
Yeah, oftentimes it comes down to these metrics where, while it is important for it to be a women-led team, we would hope for more tangible sort of, results that we can create more of a sustainable outlook for. But yeah, it gets hard sometimes in terms of how do we evaluate it and how do we put that criteria on it.
Right.
I'd love to go next, Joy, and this is great, really helpful, and also lovely to see everyone and to see you, Joy. So thank you for curating the space. So, I work at Dahlberg, which is a strategy consulting firm focused on social justice issues, and I work here in the US and overseas. All to say, I live in many worlds when it comes to how folks think about women's economic empowerment. So two of them in particular, those who have women's economic empowerment strategies, whether they are funders, large family foundations, their governments, bilateral aid agencies, a number of folks have strategies to increase women's economic empowerment. They typically frame it as either building just the number of women leaders out there, business leaders, or building income, building access to markets, access to inputs, access to capital, and they do speak a little bit about the power part of women's economic empowerment, but often I think more in theory than in reality. Once you start actually doing the programming, it ends up just focusing a lot more, as Adi said, on the more what is considered more tangible. The other space I'd like to highlight is how I've perceived the GBV world talk about women's economic empowerment, which is both as a prevention strategy. So women's economic empowerment is a prevention strategy for GBV, but also kind of somewhat interestingly, an ultimate outcome, phrases like every survivor an entrepreneur kind of almost pits them against each other in an interesting way. But certainly organizations that try and provide support for survivors and with outcomes being that survivors are economically empowered women.
Other facts. Sasha, where does this show up in your world?
Gosh, I'm really thinking about this a lot, and I have to admit that I'm a little bit like Shruti in the sense that, so I work as a funder and as an advisor. So being a funder of grassroots organizations, what I've seen is, these women are really wanting to, from my experience of talking to women, site visits, seeing these groups, that the economic empowerment is very much about keeping or getting children in school and accessing health care for their children and their family. And then on the other side, there's funders that come with ideas that they already have about economic empowerment, and they want schemes that are going to so-called economically empower women, but the variety is so wide that there are no broad-based development outcomes that we're ever going to achieve. The belief like that microloans is going to give us broad-based development outcomes is not true. In my opinion, I apologize, please correct me. I would love to believe that they would. So there's a lot of this, let's just get women at a level where they're earning some income, but there's this lack of looking at levers that could actually bring women to some sense of self-actualization. So I find them schemes that are very limiting, whereas women on the ground have this goal to get health care for kids and children in school. That is from my experience of visiting sites, talking to women. So that's what I...
That's helpful. Victoria, how's this framed in your world? Actually.
So mine, I was going to say something a little bit similar to what Shruti said, in that, so I come from a GBV world, and so the lack of women having economic security means that they cannot build and maintain a safe household. And so until women are empowered, economically empowered, and have economic security, they cannot be safe, and therefore there cannot be gender equality. So that's sort of how it's framed. Like if you think in terms of like intimate partner violence, a woman who does not have access to cash can't pick up with her children or individually and leave. A woman or a teenager who is experiencing violence in their home because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity can't leave their parents' home and go get an apartment somewhere. They end up on the street or in a shelter where, they're not safe there either necessarily. So that's very much how it's framed in how I work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just interesting. I don't know if people are picking up patterns of like the means or the end. Right? There's just an interesting as these different worlds come together in terms of that. Couple more comments. Lauren, curious about.
Thanks, Joy. In a sense, I think I live between two different worlds. So I work for the U.S. government's Development Finance Institution, the DFC. And in one world, there's a theory of change that women's economic empowerment will drive global development, and you'll see better outcomes for women and girls and their families and their communities. And I think in many ways, there are outcomes that are driving global development in a positive way. But I think part of the challenge for us, and several people have mentioned this, and Shruti in particular, kind of picking up on your comment, there's maybe kind of an overly simplistic view of counting women. If we have X number of women entrepreneurs or Y number of women who are microloan recipients, that magically we will have this global positive global impact. And I think that the really talented fund managers that we work with are the ones that go much deeper, and they're looking at what is life like for a woman who lives on less than $5.50 a day or $3.20 a day. And holistically, what's going on in the household in terms of shelter, water, sanitation, and hygiene, access to education for kids, and what does it mean to be vulnerable and to live with that type of vulnerability which may erupt into domestic violence. So these fund managers are looking holistically at women and not just counting women, but valuing women and valuing the products and services that help improve the lives of women. And part of it is economic empowerment, and part of it is social empowerment, having a voice in the community, having a voice in government. And so, you know, I think that's where you get the really deep and rich understandings of what's going on an individual level. Joy, I have to say, just before this conversation, I was looking at a video that you had put into our workbook, and it was your conversation with Cornerstone Capital. And one of the points you made was, you know, there's no monolithic view that every woman acts the same way. It's just, you know, we're human beings. We all are individuals. And when you begin to look, at least from my perspective, look at each individual woman and the vulnerabilities they live with, I think you get a much better opportunity to help change the arc of that person's life.
Cool. Maybe one more. Who's left? Welcome, Lori. Are you actually able to come off video and be here fully, or are you multitasking until you can join? Hey, Lori. Oh, you're on mute though.
Oh, now I'm on mute. I'm having a really hard time because I got a huge project dumped on me, which is distracting me for being able to track on these conversations as well as I want. So I was late. So I work in the field of international development, women's empowerment, and mostly in low and middle income countries, and on violence prevention. So less the survivor-centered piece, although that's obviously part of it, but actually looking at long-term prevention. And I see a couple things. One is the relationship between women's economic empowerment or economic programming as it relates to assets, income, social protection, or dealing with shocks, access to financial services. I mean, all of that stuff gets lumped into this one term of economic empowerment. And if you look at the research and what we know, things are really complex and they're happening at multiple different levels. So long term, we know from, or at least the evidence suggests, that getting women into formal employment and the kinds of shifts in norms and distribution of labor and things that happen as women enter the workforce, and that becomes normative, that then brings levels of violence down. It's at the individual level and in the short term, especially in the mid-range of women, a lot of the savings and empowerment programs and microfinance, you know, they improve outcomes for very poor households, but they may actually increase risk of violence because they're in the short term, because they're disrupting sort of the traditional division of labor and roles and men as providers. So it really, what happens to women when you introduce a new thing of entering even informal labor or anything depends on how that's perceived by her partner or the extended household. And some will see it as, thank God there's somebody else helping. Others will see it as emasculating and somehow usurping the role of providership. And so it's a really iffy thing in the short term, but it's not something that we have to get through it to get to the long term. You know what I mean? Like, we also see data that show that as women working becomes more normative, in the same settings that it used to potentially increase risk on average, it starts to decrease risk. So this is a developmental shift that's happening and needs to happen at a macro level. And one of the challenges that we face is that most of our programs are individualized. And while we're helping small little households, these macroeconomic forces and access to the labor markets and the structure of markets and all that, we're not touching. And that's actually the levers that are going to make a big difference in the long term. And so we have a mismatch between our toolkit, which is very micro and community based, and it's important for what it is. But it's like, if you do that and you don't change the larger structures, you're never going to get through to actually, you know, the kinds of shifts that accompany when you suddenly have 2 earner households. And what's happening is these macroeconomic dislocations in jobs and the youth bulge and everything means that the old way of doing business just doesn't work. It's the same way for us. We can't survive. I mean, the kind of, you know, 1950s household is just a somewhat of anachronism. And that is happening in urban settings and in refugee settings and in rural settings as they become monetized, but there's not a new equilibrium because it's not okay still for the 2 people to be trying to take care of the house and for sharing of the care and domestic labor. And so it's this hugely tense time that's roiling throughout countries in terms of increasing risk of violence. That's my take on it.
Yeah, what she said.
What?
Other people feel that way. Whatever you say, Lori, I just go along with it. This is general feeling. No, it's amazing. And I am so, that it was such an amazing tee up of exactly where I wanted to take this in terms of what's the connection between that world of how we think about women's economic empowerment, how that intersects with the causes, the prevention, the results of gender-based violence. And then in comes this system of finance, and that's complicated, right? And so being able to pull that out a little bit and sort of tease out, what do we need to do different on the finance front to address that intersection, which I think you laid out really well. Brittany, I recognize you wanna jump in?
Sure. Hi, it's Brittany from Grand Challenges. I just want to say, you know, we frame and think about economic empowerment in terms of jobs created and sources of income created and the like at GCC, but we invest directly in gender-based violence innovations. But I think similar to Lori, it's more on the prevention front, or like the risk reduction programming, like self-defense training courses and whatnot. So I think that there's a tendency sometimes to focus so much on the health impact and the health outcomes because we're a health impact investor, and everything we invest in has to sort of have a direct linkage to a health product or service, or, you know, an improvement demonstrated in knowledge or attitudes towards, like, you know, unhelpful social norms or gender norms, these kinds of things. But I'm just really keen to learn more throughout these next couple of weeks about how might we broaden our investment criteria or our scope or our ways of measuring impact on GBV innovations that we have the ability to invest in, so that maybe we can make the case for more economic empowerment oriented programs, which we have actually. Like, we've invested in a business, Cat Africa, if you've heard of it, for example. They're based in Uganda. It's a passion fruit farming innovation that empowers women economically through giving them these business opportunities. But in order to really make the case to invest in that model, there had to be this component of sexual health and education. So, you know, how do I guess, balance like our mandate as an organization and the health focus that we have to kind of stick to, but while also, I guess, making stronger linkages between the evidence base for economic empowerment and gender-based violence reductions and what have you. Yeah.
Could you do me a favor, Brittany? And because I realize we've had 2 conversations because you were with me earlier today, and you're sort of dropping this, our portfolio about GBV innovations. Could you just drop a link to it into the chat just in case anybody else is like, exactly how do you define that? Because I think what's really, one is I could have a very long conversation with you about that, and I've talked to some folks at GCC about it, and the sort of thinking of well, all right, I'm just going to stop my brain from going down that whole path and how that all fits within it. But I think it's an interesting example of, you know, sort of thinking about Lauren coming with, you know, sort of significant portfolios that has a lens to say, we want to address women's economic empowerment, right? And so much of the stuff that Meet is doing is sort of looking on the ground and often connecting investors. And true to you, work a ton with impact investors in terms of how they think about women's economic empowerment. And I just want to name, actually, before I go to Christina, I'm sorry, do you want to weigh in here?
I guess I'm just thinking sort of to your point earlier, Joy, about how there's sort of this causality and means to an end that sometimes get blurred. And just thinking about how both economic empowerment, gender-based violence, also gender equality, these are all so interrelated to one another, but also to many other issues. And just speaking from Criterion's perspective in our work, I know we place a lot of emphasis on the process of how you would get to gender equality in a financial system or women's economic empowerment to make sure that you are taking into account the structural issues, the systemic causes, root causes, and also more aware of unintended consequences, or, like to Lori's point, what you might be experiencing, what you might have to go through to get to a breakthrough transition that leads to better outcomes. You know, if you're more aware of that, if you're more understanding of that as a potential or likely, or even the scenarios in which that is more likely to happen, then you're better equipped to address it and mitigate it as you're getting there. So that's just how I'm thinking about all the complicated interconnections.
Yeah, and I'll drop this into the chat just because I was thinking, I was just trying to Google, because I don't know, I get stuck in my own world just like the rest of you, and I was trying to think about where is economic empowerment, gender-based violence coming up together, and how are things framed? Anyway, and so I sort of, this is to be immediately blown up, but and as I think about these conversations, so I wrote this before, but so it may not hold up, but the kind of, I think there's a set of ways in which people are talking about economic empowerment as the outcome. And often the critique that is, I think, valid is when economic empowerment instead of gender equity or equality is the outcome, it can be problematic, right? That we're going to achieve women's economic empowerment but not shift gender norms or anything else around it. We're just going to get them a new business, but actually not shift, not address broader questions of gender equality. But you could say that economic empowerment is the outcome. And we work in a program in the Pacific Rise, which we've been able to do all kinds of magical stuff within that. But part of it is because the Australian government overall said your outcome needs to be women's economic empowerment. And we're like, great. That gives us reason to justify all kinds of really good gender work, because you wanted women's economic empowerment, great. We will take that and run with it in creative ways inside of the program. But in terms of what we actually get measured on. It's how many women-led businesses did you invest in? And so the kind of those things are often, if women's economic empowerment, as many of you just said, if women's economic empowerment is the outcome, the metrics on it are often odd, right? They don't get to very much more than where the money moved in general. And this is a broad swath of stuff. And I still have, I don't know if you ever all remember that AWID report that came out a few years ago about how much money moved away from rights-based work to women's economic empowerment and the impact on the field. And it was sort of this, I don't know, as somebody who's trying to bridge to finance, it was not necessarily framed in a way that people were going to hear it, but a vicious, like a really spot on. It's not that we were wrong. It was just really hard to say, read this and stop moving all of this money. Anyway, I digress. But that was an interesting example of sort of where the sort of critiques of women's economic empowerment. The second is, Mara Bolas is actually supposed to be on this call from XVII, so I'll invoke her anyway, of sort of looking at economic empowerment as an approach to programming, which is also what some of you said of like, we need an economic empowerment program in the other thing that we're doing because it's an element that we're missing. It might not be the goal, but it's a programming piece that needs to be in place. And often in that, I had actually thought of those as much more sophisticated programs. In general, it's sort of, I look at them, I go, oh, you actually get to spend all this time actually thinking about women's economic empowerment and how it fits within it. But I also do think it sometimes is add bank account and stir, right? Like that kind of just drop in a bank account and voila. The last thing, and this is where I think it starts to bridge, well, the third one is naming women's economic empowerment as an investment opportunity, right? This kind of, the growth of women's economic empowerment globally is leading to X, Y, and Z, and kind of the global development story, which is, again, a means to an end, but a means to a different end, right? And there's such a powerful argument that is made of the business case of investing in women and why by investing in women, this is an investment opportunity. And I was looking earlier today, just to give you an example for whom this is kind of different than what you live in, is SEIF's new fund, which I'm a big fan of because it's the social enterprise assistance fund. Lauren, you've invested in them. It's actually social enterprise assistance fund is, I think, what it is, but it's a really, global impact investor. And they're making a case that women's economic empowerment is their investment thesis, that if they invest in businesses that attend to women's economic empowerment, those businesses will do better. So different frames on this, right? And I think part of what we're teasing out in the middle of it is how do those different frames on women's economic empowerment tie into gender-based violence? But let me just pause there and sort of comment on the frames, or did other people notice patterns in how people talked about these different angles? Yeah, Lauren, or Liz, are you jumping in here, Liz? If so, we're, oh, can't hear you. Really want to hear you, Liz, but can't. Nope. Why don't you work on it? Oh, that's, nope.
That good?
Yes.
Become a Zoom expert in these last couple of months. But, the thing that I think is missing from all of these conversations is the idea that economic empowerment is giving women money to start businesses. That is absolutely one element. But what I see at the level that we work at with gender-based victims is holding a job down for a year is economic empowerment, but having the emotional ability to do that and needing to build up all of the levels of poverty, not just financial poverty, in order for women to flourish out of the environment where they're likely to be abused, it's a basket of things. And so often and as you said, the Australian government's measuring it in sort of this one way, and that that is sort of, I think, the structural disconnect, is that if I could take the you know, several hundred victims that we work with in depthly in a year and fund them for 3 years, 1 year to hold a job down, 1 year to get skill growth, and 1 year to grow their career so that they're actually making a wage in which they could have their own apartment without a subsidy. Their kids could have medical insurance and they could be in school, and they're breaking that cycle of violence. But we don't measure this in line with poverty, when the realities are, at least in my world, victims of gender-based violence are generally 5 times more likely to be victimized when they are at and below the poverty level. And we don't address that in these initiatives. So we get great meaning folks coming in saying, well, we want to invest in all of these, you know, women-led businesses. And I'm looking at my actual population of victims and going, I have very few here who have the ability to go out and start a business today. In 3 years, with some actual concrete training, absolutely, they'll set the world on fire. But we got to do some real legwork before we're at that point. And I see that as a huge gap in the funding metrics.
Yeah, Lori?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that a really interesting thing that you're pointing out is this narrative of women's economic empowerment has totally different salience and meaning in these different communities, right? Mm-hmm. So in one community, it's, you know, let's invest in women because it's a good economic strategy for economies and growth and all of that. There's another instrumental one, which is let's ensure equity so that women have access to banking and finance and credit and all of that. But those are all instrumental. Those are sort of a means to an end. And then there's the whole sort of rights-based and gender and everything, which says, let's, you know, all of those things are good, but there's also this transformational piece, right? And it's transformational piece at an individual level, but it's also transformational in the sense of we want investments that challenge the realities and structure of the existing gender and power and everything relationships, so that, you know, you could have the exact same outcome, but how you do it and who you do it with and the process. If you know, there's an old distinction between something that's gender aware. So we like, okay, we know women can't need to take care of children, so we provide childcare so they can participate in X program. But that's accommodating and useful, and we should do it. But it doesn't change the fact that women are doing all the childcare, and or that women only have access to service level and jobs that are gendered and paid at a lower level. And so it's sort of, there's two discourses going on. One that says we want, our ultimate goal is transformation, and with economic growth and empowerment along the way. And the other is maybe equity, but it's our ultimate goal is investment and getting women and growth and getting women jobs and all of that. And that's probably oversimplified, but I feel like those two things, they're both important, but they're not the same thing. And so you get people sort of talking like this.
Right. Yeah, along those lines, I mean, I used to work in the microfinance industry, and there was a researcher, her name was Linda Mayu, and she used to talk about women, the practical needs and the strategic interests. Right, and so that's the thing, like, and everyone thinks it's an automatic, if you focus on the practical needs, you're gonna automatically address the strategic interests, and you don't. And the practical needs are the easier, of course. So, yeah. And I haven't seen any good examples of people that are working on both and working together.
Yeah, really agree with that. And I think, you know, appreciate very much the various frames that you've laid out here, Joy, and you walked us through. I'd like to add one, but I think is particularly relevant for this conference and this group, which is economic empowerment as a kind of human rights imperative for survivors of GBV. Right? So kind of ultimately this coming coming back to the idea of, this is about GBV, this is about investing to reduce, prevent, prosecute, GBV, right? Like, when you are particularly a child experiencing or witnessing GBV, that alters every dimension of your lived experience, so that you're showing up in the world just entirely differently as you would if you were not in fact witnessing or experiencing GBV, right? So all the programs, like all the individualized programs in the world, even you just kind of, the world is just different to you. And like I was struck by in the beginning, you're talking about each of the worlds each of us live in, right? Like it's almost like survivors of GBV live in a different world, and at the same time, everyone's a survivor of GBV. So you square that circle for me, Joy. But that there is something about all our efforts to strengthen women's economic empowerment, either erase, GBV survivors, or you think of GBV as kind of a consequence, which is 100% is. It's like completely agree with what Lori said previously around, in the short term, changing the power dynamic in the short term is going to lead to unintended consequences. But like ultimately, like if we are talking about supporting survivors of GBV, like it's a human rights, it's like an imperative that we need to support all forms of empowerment, including economic empowerment.
Interesting.
Something which I think is kind of interesting. I've had a chance to work on some transactions with social enterprises in India, and one that we recently worked on was in the housing finance space. And what I find encouraging and maybe insightful is that when women are the borrowers of the loans, and these housing finance companies that we're working with, the women are the borrowers, it provides leverage in terms of the power dynamic with a partner, because the loan will default if the partner will kick the woman out of the house. I don't know, I have no evidence or data in terms of what does this mean with respect to a reduction of gender-based violence, but I do see it as potentially a powerful opportunity when women have economic tools that they can use in terms of the power dynamic with partners.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, go ahead, Lori.
No, I do think that, and I will send around some stuff. I think it's really interesting because like, the programs that we work with don't identify women as, because 30 and 40% of women in the settings we work in are in relationships where there's violence. And so it's not at all a service-based model. It is, we're working with women and we're looking at, in large randomized controlled trials and in community-based trials, what happens when you do different things in different communities to levels of violence. Right now, I think the best evidence that we have is that savings groups and microfinance groups alone have no impact on violence on average, okay? They sometimes will increase it for individual women, or they sometimes may decrease it, but on average, they improve household well-being, but they don't have an impact. Social protection programs, so actual cash to very poor households where there's conflict daily over just getting the money to go to the market, and you have an ongoing floor that is established and it's not dependent on entrepreneurial spirit or payback of loans or anything like that, that is reducing, even though they have nothing to do with violence, reduces at a population level intimate partner violence in a variety of settings. And so I think it's interesting because there's a one set of what do we do with women who are identified and have come forward and are in some sort of healing process and whatever. But then there's also what can we be doing at a whole population level to try to bring down the overall levels of violence. And I think it's important that we keep both of those in our minds.
You know, I just wanted to add, when we're thinking about tools in terms of finance, we talked about loans, you know, credit, investments, savings, we're talking about jobs, businesses, but there's also, I guess, insurance. I don't know if any of you guys work in insurance, but I mean, again, back in my microfinance days, you know, Sewa in India had created an insurance company. And I think that's just another tool to be used. I don't know how it intersects with gender-based violence, but I know it was something that I knew about many years ago. I'm not up to date on it.
Well, I mean, I think it continues so much of the microfinance, the MFI services have just diversified into insurance. And so it becomes part of the package. We were actually looking recently a little bit at climate risk insurance in emergency settings. And the part of the reality is how that climate risk insurance gets structured will either affect, right, in a moment of an emergency, who gets that cash when it's distributed is the end question, and who has control over it. I think that's coming back to your point, Lori, in terms of like when there's these disbursements of cash, which insurance should create when there's a need, but then the power structure and how it gets delivered is where tension shows up.
I'd love to add a point, I think building on what Lori shared, just as a kind of a very different lever, if you will, because Lori talked about the individual, you know, community level programming, where that, you know, and as well as macro level programming. I think one interesting additional lever we're seeing, which is a little bit in between, more in developed markets, is like norms change of like corporate culture, and like in areas where there's a lot of formal employment of people in the kind of formalized private sector, which, you know, in the US, for example, versus India, where, you know, over 90% of people like work in the work in informalized settings. I would say experimenting with approaches where corporate policies both address GBV at the workplace, which I know, you know, Joy, you've done a lot of work on, and many folks here at Criterion a lot of work, but like GBV in the home, it's a really interesting emerging link between women's economic empowerment and gender-based violence. So what do you do, for example, when one of your employees is facing GBV in the home? How do you support them disclose it, as well as, you know, like what levers do you have to help them actually navigate it, right? And I think that like in Silicon Valley, which is where I sit, there's interesting discussions around, you know, how sometimes perpetrators of violence use corporate policies as a way to kind of maintain power. So like, you know, tech company employees shifting their job location when their partner who is experiencing violence from them like goes to a shelter. So you kind of get away from the shelter by actually shifting your job location. And that's something the company is saying. So anyway, all to say that's like an intermediary lever between the individualized community level engagement and the like macro.
And I actually, so I'm going to see if I can bridge that into maybe for the last bit of this conversation, what does this have to do with investing, right? Like, how do we bring these two together, right? So we've got this, I don't know, I loved our little debate there, Shruti, where you're like, it's a journey. I'm like, it's a tangled web, it's a mess, right? Like, it's just all these things that are frames intersecting with each other. It's like somebody threw a bunch of pictures on the ground and just moved them all around and interwingled them. But I think from an investing standpoint, and at least for now, Shruti, I sort of want to put could we invest in public equities in such a way to shift corporate business? Let's take that one off the table for now. Focus a little bit more on kind of community development, finance, right? People putting money into communities in such a way that it gets to the right people. What Krista, you and Liz were talking about earlier of like, we just need an economic development program on the ground here that lets women have access to better products and services. that support them. And so one is sort of looking at community development finance, looking broadly at sort of blended finance or development finance more broadly, whatever you want to call it, in the big international world of moving money around, or this kind of angle on impact investing. And I think the piece that I'm going to name a problem that, or an opportunity that is an opportunity and a problem, which is how much capital that is the capital that is going towards gender outcomes has its goal framed and named as women's economic empowerment, right? That it's a kind of, that is the easiest thing for investors who want to make a difference on gender to say that they can do, because it has the word economic in it. And so that sounds like you could invest in it, right? So it's a nice, very comfortable place. And then the fastest translation of that is to women-led businesses, or potentially, or, you know, integration in supply chains, or sometimes it's job creation. But largely a solid swath of it has gone towards women-led businesses. And here's where I just want to name this. Like, that is a set of, you know, like a lot of money. And there are ways to influence it. But one of the pieces that is been, it's actually one of the core reasons why Criterion started working on gender-based violence, is because the argument on, oh my gosh, are we actually looking at gender equality outcomes, is like, no, we just need to start with something simple. We just need to do the first simple step. This is a first step. We'll get more sophisticated later as we learn, but just let them start with women-led businesses as the starting point. And what we've consistently seen is that not just became a starting point, it cemented in as what people think they're doing. And then we don't end up with as much responsiveness that says, all right, how do we actually come to understand a local community and what might be the financing needs? Because I want to find an entrepreneur, and livelihood businesses don't even count as entrepreneurial activity because they don't create jobs. So if a woman ends up with self-employment, doesn't count because she didn't create a job and therefore she's not an entrepreneur. We end up with these really strange dynamics that end up around that, the metrics that are being counted. So I want to name that as a thing that is happening in the world of investing. And maybe I'll put the other one out there and then just shut up and let you all talk. So that's the first one that I just wanted to insert into this. And sort of how that gets framed, what people define as success, and how could, we're not going to decide this today, but how could we change that, right? What are the levers to go into that world? Because given how all of you introduced this topic, that is not helpful, right? It is oversimplifying something that's very complex and is exactly the stuff that's going to have unintended consequences of, let's just throw a bunch of money at this situation. The second piece, though, is the kind of dimension of using the market, using finance, or changing finance. And so often these things get framed as access to the current system, and even in sort of approaches to survivor wealth or other things, there's no intent to change how finance works. It's just to include in it. Super important and in and of itself, and really careful to never say you're the last one in, we're going to change it just as you start, right? So really want to name that one. But there is a challenge because some of these systems are badly designed and they don't actually work. And so the second thing is, when are we actually changing how markets work, changing the system? And I think so much about Mita's work that's actually going in and saying how these economic systems are designed is actually reproducing gender equality because of how the markets work. And the sort of blanket the blanket story around women's economic empowerment doesn't get to how do we actually need to change how things work to get to women's economic empowerment or gender equality, whichever you're naming as your outcome. Anyway, I'll name those sort of two thought pieces to throw into the mix. Maybe see if anyone want to jump in. Yeah, I'll call you out, Jennifer, just to sort of, because I actually think Mita brings so much to this conversation in terms of how you look at things.
I'm not sure I can add anything to that. Joy, I think that you really articulated discussions that my team is having, and I lead the gender equality and social inclusion kind of technical support unit at Mita, and we're having a lot of discussions and trying to engage bigger Mita in these discussions around more inclusive finances is really important, but to what extent are we simply adding women and stirring to a system that doesn't serve them well to begin with? And Joy, as you say, it's a really important, maybe intermediate step, because in the short term, we're not going to rebuild the financial system, but we really do need to be thinking about what are the elements of the financial systems that are inherently unequal, and not, I mean, obviously not just across the gender spectrum, but across so many other identity factors as well, which I know is a much bigger discussion that we're not necessarily having right now. But yeah, it's really problematic. And is it a success if we increase access to financial systems that make women very beholden to conditions that may put them in a slightly better situation? You know, I really liked the descriptions that Lauren, that you had, and Lori and others, I think at the beginning, where we were talking about women's lived realities, and you know, a loan or an investment of some sort in a woman that either prompts her to start or grow a business, maybe putting her in a better place in the short and even long term, but it's not necessarily changing things in a way that makes the system more responsive to her needs. Anyway, Joy, I think I've just basically restated what you said, but I think it's such an important question. You know, what are our short-term goals? And if the short-term goal is to get more people able to look after themselves in a slightly safer or more safe situation, that's not a bad short-term goal, but we really need to think bigger. And how do we do that? How do we, you know, one of my colleagues texted me while we were having this discussion, and she said, why are we not just burning it all down? And that feels really good to say, but it's also not super helpful. So anyway, maybe I'll finish with that, but I really would love to hear even how to frame some of these questions so that we're talking about entry points for making financial systems more inclusive, for even making them more aware of the ways in which they are not inclusive, ways to gain allies in the system, lever points to shift things. Yeah, sorry. And again, I think I'm just saying the same thing again, but I love that question, and I'm really interested in how we can at least think about it. Thanks.
I'd love to add to that, and I think, thank you, Joy, for that prompt. To me, it's kind of both and. It's like we absolutely, you know, should think about ways to change the broader structural inequities, but we should absolutely experiment with like giving women cash and like all kinds of, because kind of my concern is that, you know, I feel like the thornier the problem, the more we hold it to like a higher standard of how to address it, and more we kind of generally discuss as opposed to actually doing it. And I understand why, and I'm not dismissing kind of the broader shifts that need to happen, but like if, you know, my counterparts who are running small tech startups are getting reams and reams of cash, right, from venture capitalists, then like I would like that social enterprise to also, like that is being led by survivors, to also get cash while we discuss, right? So like, I'm not saying that we should not discuss. I'm just saying there's kind of an immediate imperative, because I remember the leader who started this call saying, you know, we really, this is about getting more funding, right? And so a lot of it is about just, this is a very underfunded space. We should give it more funding and support women's economic empowerment while we figure out how to shift the macro.
Right. So I think in that piece, though, one of the challenges I just want to throw out on that, Shruti, is, and this is sort of the piece of, I think there's a lot of people who are moving money in that space, but Christy, it's not getting to you, right? There's a kind of broad claim of women's economic empowerment is a broadly funded space that lots of people move money to, but it isn't going out in a way that gets to you. And so still on the both, I'm with you always, Shruti, on a both and. Let's do shit and question it at the same time. It's very confusing. Like, Christy, do you know what I'm saying? It's like there's all this money going to women's economic empowerment, but not in a way that actually helps you on the ground, right?
No, exactly. And I think I'm glad there are some funders and investors on this call. From a nonprofit lens, I mean, so we're working with survivors, and I think there's some of y'all have programs that are a different structure. The women's going to people who already may be in a place where they own a business and they're in a spot where that's appropriate for them. For us who work in this world, I think the focus on outcomes is a burden. I don't know how else to say this, because I know if you're spending the money on it, if you're investing into a cause like this, you want to see what the outcomes are, but you got to trust us. You got to trust the nonprofits. Our clients are all very different. Like Liz said, some people take literally 3 years. We have a transitional housing program we just started last year, and these women take 2 to 3 years to get where they need their outcomes. And then I manage our agency data. So then I'm tracking outcomes in this little box that I got to report to the funders. It doesn't look good ever, right? Because it takes years to get people where they need to go. And really, you don't know the effect till it's a generation down the road. And has that family have a better life for themselves? Are they out of the cycle of violence? Just give us money and trust us, I swear, please. That's what I need. Yeah.
Well, Sasha, just calling you out as one of the most compassionate and least data and outcome-driven funders that I've ever met. You could talk a little bit about how you're changing other donors and I think part of this, I just want to name the field of gender-based violence is radically underfunded and needs philanthropic and government support to work. I do want to name, and I'll just make sure we're reinforcing this, that is different than moving investment dollars and shaping how those money is going out. There's an overlap between the two, and I will continue to state, and I would like anybody to call us out if we don't do this, like call us out give us 5 minutes to see if we're actually doing it. But we want to make sure that our focus on financing the reduction of gender-based violence doesn't make a whole bunch of things going, oh, we can invest to end gender-based violence and we don't have to do that philanthropic thing anymore. Because we hope that this effort increases how much funding is actually going into the gender-based violence space. I just want to name that, but navigating through how do we shape those. So Sasha and then Laura, are you raising your hand or scratching your ear? Okay, great.
Yeah, I think, Joy, your point is the one about, we're working in a system that is patriarchal and already inherently violent towards women, meaning our economic system. And so the expectation is that women have to continue to work in that system and improve their lives. And my experience, what I have seen very often is individual women within communities not being able to actually change levers and stuff in the finance system, but trying to constantly come up with solutions so they can just make a dollar. So for example, I've seen women who have been told by nonprofits here, go through this this process of talking to your husband and the men in the community and the tribal leaders and the elders and so on and so forth, and tell them your rights, and it ends up crashing down on them. And so what they do on their own is they just say, look, I got to make some money here. I got to feed my kids. I want to put them in school. I want to give them presents, whatever. I'm going to co-opt them into this, right? I'm going to say, look, honey, come and help me out in the field, and then you'll have more money for cigarettes and more money for alcohol. So I am very much of the ilk, like Shruti, of saying, just move the goddamn money and just give it to these women who know what they need to do with it. We know we need norms to shift. There's no question about that. As far as talking to funders, it's about move the money, trust the people doing the work, stop asking for burdensome, overbearing metrics, data. If you knew better, then you would be the one doing the work. So, and to, I'm sorry, I think it's Christy. Yes, to Christy's point, it's time, right? If we didn't, how did some of our greatest acts happen? It takes time, and it takes layered, nuanced, and multi-sectoral people to come together to raise women's ability to be fully self-actualized. That's another thing, is I really, really hate when people just want to raise a woman from level C to B, right? But we don't.
B+ is really should B-, you should be happy with it.
Right. Or I should go lower, M to N, forget getting to A. And I really encourage people to look at this as a broader way to elevate women. Now, again, going back to Shruti, we can't do it all at once, but just give the damn cash. Sorry to be, I just get kind of tired of it.
Yeah.
That's the way I feel right now. That's the way I feel right now. Like, give them the cash, let them do what they need to do. And then after we see what the outcomes are, then we can start dialing and fixing pieces. But if we're not actually listening to the women most impacted and bringing them into the conversation as to what they think the most important levers are to be pushed and raised and lowered or whatever dial, then, we're not really going to get to where we want to be.
Just reminds me of something that came out of an earlier conversation today that really stuck with me. One of our Kenyan partners, Shadrach, was that what you need finance to do is really account for the need for sustainability of the survival process. So yes, upfront, that immediacy, the cash, but then it transitions what those needs are and how do you actually adjust for that and create a system where that works.
I'm so glad Shadrach's an amazing leader in doing work actually with women, largely with disabilities, right? So working in rural Kenya with women with disabilities who have experienced gender-based violence, like that kind of, how do we actually recognize how hard some of this crap actually is, right? This is not like, I think we sometimes skirt over it as kind of a, well, it will empower them and things will get easier for them and they'll pull it out together, as opposed to, wow. Laura, you were going to throw something in before and then we'll.
I mean, I feel like, and hopefully this will start to sift out. So I always think in buckets. So there's the conversation, which is how to mobilize finance to be able to assist our long-term goals vis-a-vis violence. And that one, I think, is one which is what you guys are all about. And it's hard for us. It's a hard place to start because there's so many language barriers and there's so many cultural barriers and like we don't know how each other's systems work. So that's a long-term project that I think we're engaged in together. Mm-hmm. Then there's the, just give the money, which I do think is important, but I think fundamentally there's mechanisms. You need a mechanism also to do that. And there's money to individuals in creating floors, and whether that's universal basic income or that's social protection programs or it's cash transfers or something. But then there's actually the infrastructure. And one of the areas, going to Shruti's point, that I think is maybe easier for our two communities to come together is, you have all of us who are doing the frontline work on the GBV programming. And then you have the people who are doing the finance, and we travel in totally different circles, right? And actually, we both have things that we could benefit from if we came together. And one of the things that strikes me that I see that the social entrepreneur space has, and the social innovation space and the finance space, the people out in Silicon Valley, is you have all of this, you have built not only money to go into invest in things, but you have incubators and you have leadership training and you have mentorship programs for people who want to start all that. And there's nobody to help us. Nobody that's helping us think through how, if you did what you did for business on social groups, or helped sort of also use your networks and have access to those, others don't either. To me, that's a really easy win-win.
All right, Lori, I gotta tell you, this is like the whole crowd is just like, what are you saying? But you're breaking up. And so like you just came out of like, you know, if you did, oh, you're gonna go off and come back, great. So could you just do the last bit again? I was hearing most of it up until the end. You're on mute now though.
You know, I think our need is so big for survival, just like women's needs, both the people who are doing the work, that we always focus on, we just need money. But actually, even without money, we need help. We need access, we need introductions, we need someone who says, you know what, I know how to start a business. Let's create a social business that feeds in to support your shelter. I don't know how to do that. I need someone that wants to partner with me. And so those are the kinds of really concrete ways we could start to work together. I think that is not just like invest in, give us a grant.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think, you know, Brittany, are you wanting to jump in? Because I just think it's so fascinating of like the beginning of an accelerator. Like, let's try it. Like somebody in impact investing and the tomorrow night whenever. There's a conversation about impact investing in next week, and one of the focuses in that is impact investing, not as strong as Silicon Valley broadly, but has a whole infrastructure of innovation that is barely pointing to gender issues, and could, if we pushed them really hard and shamed them into it, we could point them at gender-based violence. Right, and that kind of, but how do we do that well? And to be able to do that, we have to bust through this sort of shroud of economic empowerment that is,
or apps. You know, like, so a lot of it is, it's like we need social innovation for social issues, and there's human design processes and all sorts of things, but they don't have to be towards creating a technology. They can be. But we're doing it to actually, we're using human-centered design and those types of things to solve for challenges of how to get people to shift their minds on certain things. Right. And, you know, but we're just doing it alone.
So Brittany, I'm sorry, do you want to jump in here just in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, Joy, and I'm really hoping to learn more about that these next couple of weeks as we're here, because we have a portfolio at GCC of, you know, 4 or 5 GBV innovations, I guess you can say, that we've invested in now. And GCC is like is an impact first investor. So our first priority is having a positive impact on people's lives. And if we can make a very small return on our investments to keep reinvesting, that's great. But in the GBV portfolio, so far at GCC, there aren't any, there's only one model that's like a little bit more commercial, or actually has like a revenue generating component to it. And so that might be something to think about, you know, in terms of convincing others to get on board. It's a matter of making sure you're getting the right investors around the table, I guess, who have different types of financial instruments available to them, like grant funding, which is what we have a lot of at GCC, or finding some of the models and success stories and elevating them that might have some kind of successful commercial component that other types of investors with maybe even more capital might be compelled by. And then the impact piece as well, really proving the impact in whatever that needs to look like for different funders. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I'm really enjoying listening to this conversation.
So the good news is we have 3 weeks of this, not the whole 3 weeks, but coming in and out of it and percolating and connecting when you have time through workplace as conversations start getting posted. So we've now had the first 4 conversations, we've now had the first 5 conversations. So we're sort of moved through the strategy, moved through the framing piece. We're gonna sort of move into strategy early next week, then about the middle of the week, jump to design, and then really, I think the last week, a lot of the points, Lori, that you were just raising in terms of what does it actually take to implement this? How do we build partnerships is what that last set of conversations are about. So I'm just wondering if there's some final comments about, as you leave this conversation, what are you taking into the future conversations with you? What do you want to have travel with you? Any thoughts of maybe people who haven't talked as much? Adi, you've been quiet. You want to name anything you want to take out of this conversation? If you do, you're on mute. Okay, I'm going to jump to Victoria. You want to have any thoughts? You've been quiet, but I know you're thoughtful and super smart.
Yeah, this conversation has been so outside of my realm of expertise. I've taken a lot of notes, and I think the piece that sort of, resonated with me the most was just sort of like, give the people doing the work the money. Like, they know, and I mean, this is, don't tell anybody I said this, but coming from a government—
Close your ears, Brittany. Wage is not saying this.
Not saying this at all. This is coming from Victoria. I'm not representing anybody right now. But as coming from a government place where we focus so much on result and measurement and assessing like the money that goes out, and just really understanding that, like, just give the money. The experts know what they're doing. Women are experts of their own lived realities. They know what they need to do with the money, and then measure the change in society like years down the road. Resonates so much. So if anybody has any brilliant ideas on how to do that and how to shift that narrative, super interested in hearing it. But that was the piece that resonated the most to me, because we hear it from our funded organizations all the time. Like, we know what we're doing. Stop asking us to measure like every little thing we do.
Yeah, it's like that openness. The openness to different measurement opportunities. And I know, like, we also have another program at GCC that focuses on Indigenous Canadian funding and innovation and whatnot. And actually, they're having some really interesting conversations with Wage right now on how measurement looks differently in those populations and communities. And so, yeah, being able to have those conversations is the first step.
I do want to make sure we end up with a paired balance, though, of just give the women who want to be empowered the money. Don't just give the impact investors implementing an economic empowerment program for women the money and ask them to do whatever they want with it. These are very different things, and I think we need to increase and think more sophisticatedly about how we're measuring. We're not just counting, but valuing, Lauren, to your first point, when we put impact investing money out. And then I just want to pick both of them there, because sometimes we need more and sometimes we need less. And Lauren, do you have any final thoughts on this?
Can I just, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Sasha.
Go ahead, Sasha.
I apologize. One of the foibles of the Zoom is interrupting. I know I sound like a broken record to people, but one of the things I've been really involved in over the past 10 years or so is just context matters. I think Lori brought this up before. You know, different communities have different ways of measuring outcomes that prove that a woman's life has been empowered or changed, or, you know, let's just look at change. And when I know it's really hard to measure, there are people I know in this moment who are actively putting together data and measuring outcomes that many people in the realm of measuring data would call qualitative, and that it actually can be measured, but context really, really matters.
Right. Yeah. Lauren?
I thought that the conversation about what is the investor looking for and the kind of challenges that come with investor with all their requirements and their metrics and tools and so forth, and the frontline organization that is addressing gender-based violence that needs the money and just please give us the money, thank you very much, that this tension, to my mind, brings up both a challenge and opportunity. So the challenge is, how do you bridge a different perspective, mindset, vocabulary? At one point, I think Lori mentioned, we live in completely different worlds, and that's really hard to overcome. In fact, this is one of the main reasons I want to participate in Convergence, because I'm hoping I can play a role in learning how to be a translator or a bridge. And that's the opportunity through Convergence, but also in our own worlds, is how to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes and try to understand, what are your needs? And how do you view the world? And what don't I know about you that I need to know about you in order to have a meaningful conversation and ultimately align your objectives? And I think part of the challenge here, and we often fall down on the job, is that there are misperceptions, there are people make assumptions about what the other party is looking for, and you can't really build a true alignment.
I'm on mute telling myself, yeah. And I think that's, well, and a fine statement of why we did Convergence, and continuing to think about what, I loved your point, Laura, of what else needs to get built out of this, right? Because this 3 days of conversation isn't enough, because there aren't finance people in the 16 days of action that's happening in November. And most of the places where people are having extensive conversations about gender-based violence, there's nobody there who's bringing a capital perspective. And most of the places, I mean, there's in some ways just, how do we travel to each other's places and figure out how to have those conversations? But how do we possibly do that as a set of organizations who are just trying to help some folks who are on a 3-year journey get what they need the next day? So I really also, I want to honor the people who are coming to this conversation from the grassroots, because that the value of you taking your time to come here is unbelievable, right? And and you have so many more pressures on it. We feel busy. Nobody's homeless if I don't do my job tomorrow. There's the pressures on the direct service. And so really glad that you're in this conversation.
And I'm going to see Lori's point too about if that helps Lauren and investors. I think that is something we seek too. Money and a workforce development program, like she was saying, using actual resources from people who invest money and have businesses and incubators. That is clutch. That would be, even if you're not comfortable just giving the money, as is my plea still. But yeah, I think that is just as valuable, and it can really join our worlds pretty well, I think that's a good point, yeah.
Great. Well, honoring the time, we're at time, but you're all still here because I thought this was a fabulous conversation. So I'm gonna vote that this be one that's get put up, if any. Yeah, I think this was, I would think other people would want to listen to this conversation and sort of working through these different pieces. So we'll post this conversation and see you at the next one.
Thank you,
relationship managers.
Thank you.
Anything. Yep, great.
Be well.